The story goes back years, when Chuck E. Cheese still had that creepy animatronic band. I think they were called the Pizza Time Players or something like that. Well, anyways, I was a busboy there in college, and you wouldn't believe how gross some of these places are. On a few different occasions, my location I found heroin needles, used condoms, and even dirty diapers shoved behind arcade machines. Yeah, it was pretty shady. Now that I have set the stage for you as to what kind of place this was, let me get back to how I was quarantined that night. I was working an afternoon shift, and everything seemed fairly normal at first. There was a steady flow of families coming in and out, and honestly, none of them really made a whole lot of mess. I was definitely alright with working less, so I went over and hung out by the animatronic band and watched the show for a while. Not surprisingly, our animatronics were really run down. It was pretty funny. One of them would glitch constantly, and the lower portion of the dog, Jasper T. Jowl's, mouth was completely broken. As I watched them wobble around and shake, I saw a guy pull up outside in a dark 1950s Oldsmobile, which, if you don't know what that looks like, let's just say it's a car that would definitely get people's attention in the 90s. This man inside it had this lurch-like, funeral director look to him, with a suit and a shiny balding head. The odd thing was, once he pulled up, he just sat out there in the car, staring into the establishment until the animatronic show ended. Then he stepped out of the car with a toolbox and a paperback novel in his hand. He walked slowly toward the front door and came into the restaurant. Once inside, I finally noticed how tall he was. He must have been at least 6'5", and the hostess Kim just kind of stared at him speechless. He was definitely a commanding presence. He held up some sort of badge for her to look at and pointed at the animatronics at the back of the restaurant, to which she nodded quickly and allowed him entry. Walking past me without saying a word, he got behind this goofy chef animatronic. I assumed he must have been the animatronic's owner or something, because he just opened up his toolbox and started working on it. It was strange though, he kept looking down at his novel while he was working on it. Normally, I would think he was reading instructions, but he was clearly just reading a book. I went about my business bussing tables and didn't think much of it, but he definitely gave me a weird vibe. After he worked on them for a few minutes, the band perked up as if preparing to do another show, but it wasn't the same as before. He had programmed a new sequence or something. It was really slow, there wasn't any music, and the band just looked around awkwardly in silence. The funeral director, I guess we will call him, closed his toolbox and headed back to the front of the restaurant. He made this creepy grin and winked at me when he walked by. So let's just say, I was pretty glad when he was leaving. The band just looked around for another 2 minutes or so quietly. People in the restaurant started becoming really uncomfortable. Then this disturbing bird lady animatronic looked at a child and just screamed. At this point, I had to find out what was going on. So I walked over to Kim and asked her if the repair guy said anything to her about the animatronics. She said that he hadn't, and that all she knew was that his badge said Extraordinary Engineering on it. Then the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic at the center of the band pointed out at this husky lady. He opened his mouth and this deep moan emanated from him as he began to shake violently. It wasn't random though. It was like he was vibrating in a certain pattern and frequency. Then the woman left her kids and got up from her table. She meandered around the restaurant as Chucky continued to point at her and laugh. We called the manager to see what was going on, and when he came out, he was just as baffled as we were. Then the lady started screaming in horror, like she was watching a family member being murdered or something. That's the kind of intensity. The manager rushed forward and placed his hand on her back, trying to console her, but she suddenly turned and dove at him, biting and tearing off flesh from his face, then chewing it up like melted cheese on a pizza. The large man from one of the tables rushed at her, tackling her to the ground, but then she just grabbed him by the head and forcefully began to whisper into his ear. At first, he didn't want to hear it, and he struggled trying to get away, but she held firmly and eventually something clicked in his head. He looked at the front door and ran towards it, grabbing this huge wooden bench and sliding it to the front so the door couldn't open. We stood there frozen in fear as the man looked around the restaurant, wide-eyed, breathing heavily. Kim and I took our chances and ran back into the office of the restaurant. He sprinted after us, but luckily we were able to get inside and lock the door. We immediately tried calling the cops from the office phone, but the line had been cut. Luckily, the manager kept an emergency cell phone on his desk, so we used that to call them. However, you know when you call 911, they're supposed to stay on the phone with you and everything? That's not what happened. After collecting some basic information, she asked us to describe the car of the man who worked on the animatronics, and when we told her, she fearfully said that the authorities were on their way and hung up. We waited in the back office for at least a half an hour, listening to the screams and cries of customers dying inside the restaurant. When we heard something sliding down from the outside of the building walls, I unlocked the door and peeked out of the office very quietly to see what was going on outside. I saw that the outside windows were now covered with yellow tarp, like we'd been quarantined inside. I called 911 again and was immediately handed off to an investigator who asked me only to speak when answering his questions. Then he said something that shook me to the core. We were not the only restaurant that this had happened to that day. Apparently, 3 other places with similar animatronics had been visited by the same man. The only thing is that, with the others, several of the restaurant patrons had gotten out of the building and were shot by authorities. They also garnered that, whatever the condition was, it was spread through speech patterns. Therefore, until they figured out what was for sure going on, they were not able to speak to us, and we were not allowed out of the building. That was when one of the restaurant patrons started pounding on the office door. Eventually, after a few solid hits, an obese man busted through the door into the office. He went straight for Kim, knocking her to the floor and bashing her head onto the ground. I lunged at him, but he was surprisingly strong and quickly got control. Then he began to whisper into my ear. He said, "Forget the future, forget the past. Life is over, breathe your last." The way he said that phrase triggered something in me at a very deep level. My mind began to race, and somehow I began to understand at my core the insignificance of all beings, and it made me angry. It was an anger so strong I've never felt before. It boiled up inside me and eventually became a scream so loud and intense that it tore my vocal cords. Then I don't remember anything after that. I woke up in a hospital handcuffed to a rail on the bed. I knew something awful had happened here, but the atrocities I committed that night, I will never know. The official story is that I attacked Kim in a fit of rage and killed her. I knew that wasn't true though, and that's all I had to go on. God knows what actually happened. Authorities were eventually able to contain the entire situation, and it was masked as an outbreak of some biological foodborne pathogen. Due to various corporate interests, it wasn't spoken about much in the news. These days, it would even be difficult to look it up anymore. As for me, I ended up in an institution. It's taken me years, but I think I'm almost at the point where my psychiatrist will approve me to leave soon. Funny thing is, though, to be honest with you, nothing has changed about the way I think. I pretended to be recovered for so many years that it's difficult to remember how to act any other way. Ever since the moment that man whispered those words to me, all I have thought about was how to get out and spread the message to others. Now that I think about it, I may have already found a way. Hi, my name is Mark, and I've been the manager in my local Chuck E. Cheese for a few years. And weird things have been happening here, things we can't explain. I figured, what the heck, I'd post about it here. Maybe get some answers. Where to start? Let's start simple. So we may have a thing living in our ball pit. We don't know what it is, or even what it looks like. Just sometimes kids go in and they never come out again. We find pieces of bodies in the ball pit sometimes. Oddly enough, it's never attacked adults. At least not visiting ones. Employees sometimes. And it doesn't attack everyone who enters. Just feeds once or twice a day. To answer the obvious, yes, we have removed all the ball pits. But we never found anything. Just some bloodstains and some chewed up limbs. It likes meat, we know that. And we know it has teeth. We just don't know what it is. Occasionally, we have our leftover food. We toss it in the ball pit, and like clockwork, it vanishes. We even named it Gary. Why Gary? Well, why not? Then there's Frank. Frank is a 5-foot-tall rat that lives in our basement. We don't know how he got there, but he's been there ever since I started working here. He doesn't bother anyone. Really funny thing is that the schematics for the building doesn't actually show up as us having a basement. We mostly keep the costumes, defunct animatronics, and others down there. Frank and his brood have made nests in their insides. We've considered using him as a mascot. The real-life Chuck E. Cheese. But that was turned down by corporate. Still, Frank's friendly. Well, friendly as far as rats go anyway. Oh, and the basement door changes on a regular basis. Around every 13 days. Oh, and before anyone asks, yes, we have fed Frank to Gary. But he always comes back. Or a rat of the same size at least. We're currently on, as far as I'm aware, Frank number 17. Our play area is haunted too. A ghostly child has been spotted on the indoor jungle gym, the thing we have on site. You know the thing I'm talking about, with the slides, tunnels, little viewing windows. Well, there's a ghost girl in there. She's described as a girl between 8 and 10, with brown hair and bleeding eyes. She wears a yellow dress, sometimes green, and can be seen in the play area. We'll call her Emily. And besides some scratches on a few kids, she seems mostly harmless. There's also the living video game. It's called The Cave Runner, and it moves all around the establishment. It also changes in plot from player to player, and some minor gameplay changes. Also, it never damages anything by moving. The machines just make it room. We think it might be alive. It's completely harmless, but still worth mentioning. Another weird thing is the living costumes. Well, we say they're living anyway, but the jury's still out. We have some old costumes from the 90s that employers would wear. However, they're not in regular use anymore. At least not by us. But the things still walk around the place. They hug children, take pictures, and everything. But no one's in them. Some have even heard them speak. I pulled one aside like a normal employee and found I couldn't remove the head. So I'm not sure what they are. They don't seem harmful. Something that is harmful, though, is the sauce puddle. It's an ever-present puddle of bubbling hot pizza sauce on our kitchen floor. Mary fell face first into it and got third-degree burns. We've cleaned it up, but it always comes back. It's been measured to be around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and as far as we know, it's bottomless. We can mop it up, sure, but if we drop stuff into it, it's like quicksand. We don't know where it came from, which seems to be a bit of a theme around here. Also worth mentioning, only objects sink. Humans who fall in it hit the tile like the normal floor, just with really hot pizza sauce there. Anyway, now that you know the place and some of the happenings here, I'll get into why I'm telling you all this. It all started yesterday. I came in for my shift to open the doors. I seen one of the night staff had slipped and fallen into Gary's pit. All that was left was a pair of bloody handprints and a mop. I sighed, grabbed the tool, and cleaned the mess. I locked the basement that should be there, didn't need Frank greeting our guests, and got to work getting the place presentable. We had a makeshift barrier around the sauce, which I scooted around and unlocked the freezer. I got everything ready for the morning crowd, as my coworker, a stoner guy named Andrew, came in. "Hey, put up a help wanted sign. Some poor guy on the night crew fell into the ball pit," I mumbled, realizing how bizarre that would sound out of context. Half awake, Andrew nodded groggily. I could tell he was a bit hungover, but he worked in the kitchen, so it's not like he had to greet people or anything. He did as I asked, and got to work cooking. I did an inspection of games around the place, made sure it all worked. I also tracked down Cave Runner, which was between a classic Pac-Man machine and a stunt bike racing game today. Didn't see Emily any so far, but the mascots were already moving out. It was normal, as far as this place goes anyway, a day on the job. Things started getting weird. Well, weirder as I finished my inspection. As I circled back into the kitchen, Andrew pulled me aside. "Psst, Mark, who's that?" He gestured to the prize corner, where kids had taken tickets to exchange for goodies. Mostly trinkets, toys, etc. We don't carry stuffed animals anymore, after the Great Rebellion of 11. Anyway, at the booth was a guy in an employee uniform. Now that might not sound weird, but neither of us recognized him. He was a slender guy, with chocolate brown hair trimmed neatly. He had a broad smile on his face, as if he was excited for the day. "I don't know," I said to him, noting the weed on his breath as he responded, "Think corporate sent him?" Thank God he was kitchen staff. "Take a breath, Mint. I'm gonna go talk to him." I patted Drew on the shoulder and approached the mysterious dude. "Hey, guy." He turned and threw his hand out, saying in an overly chipper voice, "Hello, I'm Al. You must be the manager, Marcus." "It's Mark," I said, shaking his hand. Firm grip on that one. I noted the guy never blinked. Not once. "Did corporate send you?" "Something like that." "Uh-huh. Well, just watch out around the ball pit. Accidents happen." He nodded, still smiling broadly. That guy gave me the creeps. After that, things returned to relative normalcy. I went to my office to smoke a cigarette. I was startled by my office phone ringing. It was a red phone corporate installed in my office, long before it was my office. That's where I spend the little bit of time I had every day, after my daily walkthrough and morning setup, before the place opened fully. I arrived around 5 a.m., hand Andrew around 7:30 a.m., and the place opened around 9:45 a.m. Weird time, but what are you gonna do? Place needs a lot of maintenance. I picked it up, but as I did, it hit me. This phone didn't receive calls. As in, it literally couldn't. Only make them. It was something corporate did to discourage socializing on the job. It had 3 buttons, one for corporate, one for emergency services, and one for ordering ingredients. Hello? I asked, confused. Mark, I see you. Then I heard the dial tone. This stuff happened every hour on the hour until I left. This morning when I came in, I did my morning routine and entered my office, and it rang again. Is this you? The voice spoke again. Who is this? Feed Gary. He's hungry. I see you, and I'll keep seeing you, Mark. Dial tone again. I figured it was this place messing with me, but I conceded and heeded the advice on the voice on the phone and fed the ball pit monster. While doing this, it hit me. No one but the employees knew about Gary. Speaking of which, it was Gary's feeding time. Every day around this time, we closed the ball pit, complete with a curtain around the whole thing. We tossed some extra slabs of meat in the pit and cleaned the things out. But that usually takes a few hours, so I'll have to get back to you. Don't worry, by the way. There's plenty more from our quaint establishment. Maybe I'd tell you about the great stuffed animal rebellion of 2011. You'd be amazed what a cheese grater can do to the human body. Anyways, this is Mark, manager of the weirdest Chuck E. Cheese there is. I'll see you around.